So we'll take a quick look at the major classifications of the balance sheet and okay. Keeping in mind we're looking at financial information at a given point in time, okay? We got the elements on the balance sheet that we're going to classify them first by that. So first you're going to classify by assets, liabilities, and your stockholders' equity accounts. And we have to keep in mind the proper definition of each of those, because a lot of times when you're doing problems and exercises in this, you're going to have to make the judgment calls. For an asset, does it have future economic benefit? Is it obtained or controlled by the entity as a result of past transactions and events? Liabilities are not just going to be your known accounts payable and bonds payable and notes payable, but they're probable future sacrifices of economic benefits. So these can be contingent liabilities that we're going to have to be aware of as well. Your equities, when we're doing, that's probably the most complicated part of the balance sheet, and we'll get into, you can see there's a whole lot of other detail that gets added here that we'll get into in the chapter. So anyway, the first way we classify on the balance sheet is by assets, liabilities, and equities, but definitely do not stop there. We classify them by their major characteristic. Are they short-term or long-term, current or non-current? So we'll have our current assets and then our long-term assets, our current liabilities, long-term. And then we go by type or function. So we start off with, you know, the current assets. You might have your operating assets, your cash, your short-term investments, your accounts receivable, your prepaid expenses. So those would be your operating assets. They have different characteristics than investments and from intangible assets and from other assets, okay, that can all, so you're going to classify by, you know, type or function. So different categories have different implications for financial flexibility, and they have different characteristics in terms of liquidity. So your operational assets, you're probably not going to sell them very soon. Your assets held for investment, you're probably going to convert those to cash sooner than your operational assets. Another thing to keep in mind, the intended use may be more important in classifying something than its liquidity. So if you have a fund that's intended to pay off long-term debt, that fund could be very marketable, it could be extremely liquid, but that's not the important thing about it. The important thing is that it's management's intention to hold it long-term to meet a future obligation. So it's not intended to be available to settle anything current, so we're going to classify that as long-term. So a lot of this chapter is really sort of thinking about what the major categories mean and what makes sense to go into each one. Okay.